Welcome, ladies and gentlemen, and thank you for having me here at such an inconvenient time when we're all thinking of getting a drink or going home. China as a global clean energy champion. This was a title given to me by a publisher, and some of you may have been, last October, Roland Danreuter had a book launch on energy security. Some of you might have gone. Well, this is a book launch, but with a difference, because there's no book yet, okay? It's more like when you launch a ship, the structure is there, but the detail isn't, and you launch it and see if it floats, okay? So that's what I'm going to do today, okay? Launch it and see if it floats. So I was given the title China as a Global Clean Energy Champion by the publisher, but being an academic and a skeptic of anything, I added the lifting the veil, and you will see what I mean by that in a few minutes. And just to say, I have a co-author in this particular book, Professor Zhang Sufeng from China, who does a lot of the detailed work on what's going on, and I provide the sort of the shape and the conceptual framework. So, what do we see? Now, I could have lots of slides. I've got no slides, but all the slides would be graphs that go like that, everything getting bigger, or things like energy intensity getting smaller. And I've just got bored of showing these graphs for the last 15 years, so I'm not showing any graphs. You can imagine the graphs as I speak. So non-fossil fuel energy. It's got the largest fleets in the world of hydro, wind, solar PV, and still growing rapidly. It's got a large and rapidly growing fleet of nuclear power, and a huge manufacturing and export industry in all these fields. So that's the sort of the clean energy or renewable energy, as you like. Fossil fuel energy, it's also doing great things. It's closing the old inefficient plants. It has the largest fleet in the world of the most advanced coal-fired plants, ultra supercritical, if that means anything to you. These are pretty fancy stuff. We don't have them in Britain, and I think America might have one. China has many, okay? It's also trying to switch from coal to gas. It's closing its old dirty industries, steel industries, and it's getting rid of nitrous oxides out of the thermal power plants. Technologies, it's caught up with the renewable energy technologies. It's a world leader in ultra-high voltage transmission, which means how do you take electricity over 3,000 kilometers without losing it. It's got a potential to be a really important player in battery technologies, okay? So it's up there with Korea and Japan, maybe not for cars, but for power systems, large batteries as large as the building that we're in, okay? Electric cars. Generation 4 nuclear, i.e. the next generation of nuclear plants. China is also likely to be a major player. Carbon capture and storage. So wherever you look, China is near the leading edge in clean energies. It's also done a remarkable job on its own energy efficiency. That's the graph that goes like that. Energy intensity, carbon intensity going downwards. And it managed to achieve a peak of carbon emissions in 2013, temporary. It went up in 2017. But at least it's flattening out. So you can see why people would want to call China a clean energy champion. Not only at home, but going overseas. It is a major player in a lot of clean energy markets and will continue to be in new technologies as well. So that's why people get excited about what's going on in China. But of course, as academics, as many of us are, we have to ask a number of questions. So I've got 3 practical questions. First, how do they do it when almost nobody else manages to do it? Secondly, what is going not so well and why? And finally, to what extent can other countries emulate the China example? Because that's what, from a policy point of view, you guys come from all over the world, is interesting question to ask. But being an academic, I have an academic slant to it too. I'm interested in institutions, institutionalism, and I'm going to define that in a minute. But essentially, institutional theory would look at China and say it will be very bad at adapting to a new challenge. So there's an academic question, how has it managed to adapt, when the institutionalists would say it shouldn't be able to. Okay, so that's what it's all about. So the structure of the talk, I'm going to give a brief overview of institutionalism so you know the theoretical background that I'm coming from, apply that generally to China, and then sort of go into a collage of different aspects of China's energy sector, looking at, the low carbon electricity and manufacturing, fossil fuels, energy efficiency, the nexus of water, energy and food, carbon pricing, and then come up with conclusions. And the focus is mainly, but not entirely, electricity. One, because that's what I and my colleague have been working on, but also two, modernizing societies use more and more electricity, so that is where you have to look if you're going to understand the low carbon transition in any country. Okay, so institutions. When I was studying China's energy sector in the 1990s, I used to be a geologist, okay, so I transformed into social science, and I was studying energy economics, and people would show supply and demand curves, and I'd look at China and say, these explain nothing, okay. Market forces almost zero in the 1990s in China. And then several years later, somebody introduced me to the study of institutions, and I thought, yes, this is what I need. So in this context, the institutions are the formal and informal rules of society, the expectations, and the behavioral norms. Okay? So it's basically, how does a society work? And there are 4 Nobel Prizes in this field from Coase, North, Williamson and Ostrom. So there's a whole now vast literature, and I'm just going to take 1 or 2 dimensions of that to help us frame our thinking as we look at China, but you could apply it to any country. So we have these formal and informal rules in any society, and that includes, when you come in as a student, you have to register there. Formal rule. Informal rule, I say good morning, you say good morning back to me. Okay? So all societies have these formal and informal rules and expectations, because without them you couldn't get up in the morning and know what to do. If there were no rules, life would be completely anarchic. So every society has these formal and informal rules. And that's great, because when we get up, we have a rough idea of what's going to happen. But at the same time, these rules and informal constrain change. Okay. So they do great things. They allow us to go about our daily business. They allow governments and companies and actors of all types to get stuff done, but they constrain change. So generally the thesis is that change in any society is incremental, step by step. Very difficult to have a big change. Except maybe pressures build up to what are called critical junctures, and suddenly, bang, everything changes. But even these are rare, and I'm going to choose a political example here. The Arab Spring in Northern Africa, pressures, social and economic and political pressures were building up for change, slowly. One young man burns himself to death in Tunisia, and zoom, everything changes. Yeah. Pressures build up, suddenly you have a critical juncture. Or do you? Look at Egypt. Has anything changed? Not really. Yeah, because the institutions in many of these countries were there. There's a sort of change, but then it quickly goes back to something like it was. Okay, so that's a very brief introduction to the generalities of institutions. They allow us to do things, but they constrain change. Now, Oliver Williamson, one of the 3 Nobel Prize winners, had a very nice diagram that I use a lot that says there are 3 levels of institution. The top is what he calls embedded institutions, which is culture. Okay, it's the deep things in society that make Chinese different from Americans. Yeah. These things change very slowly, okay? The general beliefs that have been certainly in China for hundreds or thousands of years, okay? Almost invisible, people don't even think about them, and we'll come back to them in a minute. Then you have the institutional environment, which is basically how does the political, economic, and social and legal system work, okay? And that can change over decades, okay? New forms of government come in, they change the way that stuff is done. And at the very bottom, the third level, you have the rules that govern specific transactions, okay? So a particular contract, a particular law that governs how things are done, okay? They can change immediately, okay? Now, the problem is, if you start changing the bottom level very quickly, and the middle level doesn't change, you have a disaster. Think about Russia in the 1990s, post-Soviet Russia, with Washington consensus rules. They said privatize, liberalize, and what happens? The place falls apart because you changed all the rules at the bottom, but the way things are done, the institutional environment hasn't changed, okay? So you can't rush. That's another reason why you cannot rush change, because you can bring in new rules, but if the way that everybody does business, the government works, the legal system works, if that doesn't change, you can't move. Okay, so that's the sort of societal level, how to think about a society, embedded institutions, institutional environment, specific rules. But we're also interested in energy, okay? And so we need to look at what the organizational sociologists call the organizational field, which is how does the energy supply chain work? Not only the economics and the rules, but how do people think? And I've worked in mining, I've worked in oil and gas, and I've looked at electricity. These all have quite different cultures within these businesses. Okay, so we need to take account of that as well as looking at the big picture. And that applies to your country, any country. You've got to look at the whole big picture and then the specific organizational field, not just what are the formal rules, but what are the informal rules, the ways of thinking in that business. So that's very simply institutionalism as I'm going to apply it. Okay. Then quick look at China. Embedded institutions, culture. Who's been to China? You. Right, 2, 3. Anybody, is there any Chinese in the room? I don't think so. Yes? Mainland China. People's Republic. Right, good. Then I will probably offend you, but that's tough. There isn't time for sophistication. So the embedded institutions in China are quite different from what you would find, say, in Anglo-Saxon, the US and the UK. There's this belief in conformity, fitting in with everybody else, hierarchy, yeah, you always respect your superiors, that includes Wojciech. Appropriate behavior, not sticking out, not too much individualism, particularly under the current leadership. The role of the family, guanxi, which is a particular type of personal relationship. So there's a whole raft of stuff that for the foreigner going into China is quite different. We're going to sort of park that because what's more important to our discussion is the institutional environment. How does the political, legal, economic system work? The political system hasn't changed a lot since Mao took over. And if one was being historical, you could say that even Mao was a type of emperor. You've got a one-party state, authoritarian, particularly under the current president, but fragmented. And that means it's such a large country. There are 5 levels of government. God knows how many ministries. That if you're the guy at the top and you send down orders, there are many actors who are going to deliberately or unintentionally screw up what you're trying to do. And thus, although it's authoritarian, it is fragmented, and that is a thesis that goes back to the 1980s, Kenneth Lieberthal. And you've also got powerful state-owned enterprises that have their own interests, which means it's actually very difficult to get stuff done in China, even a leader like Xi Jinping. So I'm going to come back to that. Economic change, yes, in much of the economy, the last 30, 40 years has seen radical economic change. In the energy sector, as we shall see in a moment, less so. Okay, so 80% of the economy radically changed, 20% still very much almost planned. Legal system, uneven. You read in the newspapers sort of human rights law, all of that, not much change. Criminal law, not much change. Commercial law, yes, quite a lot of change, but the courts are still controlled by the Communist Party. Finance, also important. State-owned banks continue to play the key role, particularly for large sectors such as energy and infrastructure. So we've got a society that is, and a political system, an economic system that is quite different from what you would find in Britain or in North America. And again, Douglas North and colleagues divided the world into two types of social order, they called it. There's the open access social order, which is a bit like the US and Western Europe, where competition for political or economic power is open. Yeah, anybody can be prime minister or president, as we've seen in both America and in the UK, regardless of competence. Likewise, anybody can create a company like Bill Gates in a garage and become one of the world's richest men, right? In limited access social orders, that is much more difficult, okay? Most of the world is a limited access social order. Some are chaotic, like Somalia. Some are relatively ordered and mature, like China. Okay, so you've got a society where competition is not open. You've got a single party in power that controls a lot, but not everything. And what Douglas North and people said, and I should have said this before, that these sorts of societies where conformity is important, appropriate behavior is important, where hierarchy is important, are less adaptable than the open access social orders like the US, okay? So they would say China, Japan, Korea, very difficult to adapt to new challenges, US, easier, and we're going to come back to that. So the argument would be that China has low adaptive capacity. However, as we've seen, in many parts of the economy, it's been remarkably successful. Change has happened, and the economy is thriving, and many parts are hugely dynamic. Even in the energy sector, policy experiments are allowed if the government sanctions them. And the government, particularly at central level, are very good at what's called policy learning. They learn from failure and they move on, they adjust and whatever. So you've got an entrepreneurial society. You've also got fairly thoughtful and flexible within the party constraints, flexible bureaucracy. Now, that's China as a whole. If we go to the energy sector, we get a very particular picture. This is the sector, one of the sectors that has changed the least in the last 20 years. So in the 1990s, there was great hope, reform, opening up, liberalization of energy. They did restructure, but there wasn't much competition. Now, I'm not saying it's a bad thing or a good thing, but just saying that's what's happened. So you've got state ownership of much of the electricity, oil and gas, and coal industries, state ownership either at central government level or at local government level. Strong policy direction, direct support for initiatives, and as we'll see that if the government wants something done, it throws money, it gives orders, it sets targets, you will do that, here's some money, go and do it, okay? So there's not much sign of the market in the energy sector, but at the same time, you've got these state-owned enterprises. The big ones have 1.5 million employees. These are large companies. Even the local state companies will have tens of thousands of employees. And so these companies will have their own interests. Local governments will have their own interests. So the central government has a real struggle getting stuff done, but it does things in the old-fashioned way, which is to set targets, pass down orders for stuff to be done, and where relevant, pass down money to make sure that it is done. There's not a lot of scope in the energy sector for bottom-up initiatives. Okay, so in that there's a contrast with, say, Denmark. Anybody from Denmark here? No, I mean their wind power grew from the bottom, okay, not from the top. China, very top-down in the energy sector. Okay, so that's the sort of the energy sector, the China view, institutions, theoretical background. We can now plug on. So first example, which is the biggest because it's the most important, and if I don't have time to finish some of the others, we can leave them. Low carbon electricity and low carbon electricity equipment manufacturing, okay? Because this is what everybody talks about, wind and solar. But also we shouldn't forget hydro and nuclear. You may not like them, they've got all sorts of problems, but in terms of carbon, they are relatively low carbon, though you've obviously got to look at the full cycle of constructing a nuclear plant or a dam. So these have a long history, dams back to the 1950s, nuclear back to the 70s. State-owned, state-financed. Initially, there just to provide energy, now part of the clean energy strategy. Chinese companies, as I said before, now dominate large-scale dam building across the world, particularly in Africa. And Chinese companies now have almost all the technology for building nuclear power plants and, as I said, are moving on to build their own advanced nuclear technologies and will be exporting them. They are already exporting their own designs in Argentina, Pakistan, and most probably in the UK as well. But that's not the key story. The key story is wind and solar. Initially, they brought them in the 80s and 90s, slowly for rural electrification. Okay, so that's how they started. The poor people, hundreds of millions of peasants, how do we give them energy? Small-scale hydros, wind, solar. And then during the 90s, this gradual realization of sustainable development priorities, they started to sort of try and encourage wind and solar, but it didn't really work because there wasn't enough political effort and it was badly coordinated. But from 2003, there's been a real effort, and that's where you've seen the capacity just grow like that of wind and solar. Why? Were they trying to save the world? No. They wanted, the first priority was industrial. There's a State Council document that says very clearly the first priority is to build the industry, we will then deploy. I.e. already back in the early 2000s, we want to be an industrial leader at global scale in wind and solar. So we support research and development, we support the manufacturers. They can then deploy wherever, exporting for solar, domestic for wind, okay? So there was support all the way along the supply chain, from research and development through manufacturing, through deployment, okay? So the complete supply chain, tens of billions of dollars. It's impossible to count it because some of the support was sort of invisible, local governments giving cheap access to land for factories, cheap electricity, etc., etc. Local governments were supporting the manufacturers for employment and tax revenue. So everybody was in on this. There were almost no losers, except the German manufacturers of wind or whatever, American manufacturers of solar. So local state-owned enterprises, private enterprises, local governments, central government were all in this endeavour. And it underpinned this massive growth, the graphs of capacity and use of solar and wind. Wonderful. Yes and no. This is my first but, lifting of the veil. In both wind and solar, there's high rates of curtailment. That means lots of energy that could be used is not used. Okay, so the amount of energy that is used is at the rate is about half that you get in the USA. There are dozens of reasons for that. There's sort of the more technical reasons, the geography, they didn't get it in the right place, poor data of wind resources, low quality technology, lack of grid connection, focus on capacity targets. They set the target in terms of capacity, not in terms of energy. Poor maintenance, etc. A lot of these have been sorted out in the last few years. But there's a real problem. This is where we should have a map. Oh, we have a map. Right. China is a big country. Most of the wind resources and solar are up here. Most of the economic activity is down there. Okay. So you're a long way from the market. And the grid may not want to take it. Okay. Or may not be able to take it that far. What else? Poor coordination. You think, it's a planned economy, but they can't plan very well. Poor coordination between the project developers and the grid and the local governments. And what I would call the Planning Commission, now called the National Development and Reform Commission, was unable to get these people to work together. But there's more fundamental stuff too that's more difficult to change. If you have wind and solar, it's up one day, down the next. It fluctuates hour to hour. You need other sources of electricity that are flexible. Most coal-fired plants are not flexible. Most power in China is coal. So they don't have the flexible power to balance. Okay? They don't have enough gas, pump storage, hydro, and other forms. Okay? So there's a real problem in the system. The other problem in the system is dispatch. Dispatch is when somebody controls which plant they take electricity from. Dispatch is organized at provincial level, not at a wider level. So communication across the country when dispatching electricity is poor. It's a very narrow physical market, if you like, so you can't dispatch across the country very easily. In addition, they still got the planned approach to dispatch. So at the beginning of the year, they say, right, we'll give you this many hours, you this many hours, you this many hours, whatever. So this means that the whole system is not adapted to this flexible approach, either at a regional scale or at local scale, to deal with intermittent renewable energy. And more recently, the local governments have been not dispatching renewable energy. Why? Because they are favouring coal-fired energy, because that's what they've already had, that's where all their workers are, that's where they get their tax income. Why should we dispatch this renewable energy, even if the president tells us to? Okay, so this is basically deliberately going against central government orders because of local politics, people demonstrating outside local government offices. So what do we see? We see huge success in absolute terms, but it's come at a huge cost, real cost of dollars or renminbi, opportunity cost. That money could have been spent elsewhere, but it's also an inefficient use of that money, okay, because you're not getting the best out of those resources that they've invested in. And the same can be said in manufacturing. Okay, if you read the Financial Times over the last couple of years, you will see that there's been vast overcapacity in the manufacturing, not only of solar PV and wind equipment, but also of everything, steel, whatever. And so some of these companies are private, and they've gone bankrupt. Some very big solar PV companies have gone bankrupt, okay, because prices have come down, which is great, but they can't make any money. So this huge push has come at a huge cost to the taxpayer or the state, and it has been very inefficiently used, and you've got all these energy facilities out there that are not being used fully, and this whole situation has been made worse because the economic slowdown to just 6.5%, but also the restructuring of the economy away from heavy industry means that electricity demand has slowed. And so there is a vast surplus of electricity generating capacity, and even the coal-fired plants are operating at less than 50%. Even the nuclear plants are not operating at full capacity. So they, at least in the short term, they've got a big problem there. So great success, huge cost, huge inefficiency, allocation of resources. So that's the renewable energy story, or the solar PV and wind story. More briefly, fossil fuels. As I mentioned before, there have been huge strides in the thermal efficiency of these new plants. You know, they are among the most efficient plants in the world, the cleanest, sulfur dioxide, nitrous oxide doesn't come out the top, and it's really efficient plants. So great thermal efficiency, minimizing air pollution, constraining the rise of coal use, deliberately trying to stop people using coal, using administrative measures again. Basically, we close you down if you're inefficient, we set standards for efficiency that are very high, and if you don't do it, we will deal with you somehow, and etc. So that's been hugely successful. So if you look at the direction of China's coal-fired fleet, it's amazing. A complete transformation from 15 years ago. However, again, some buts. In 2013, Xi Jinping, as part of his economic reform or reform of governance, I think quite wisely said central government should not have to approve every infrastructure project. Everything is just clogging up in Beijing. Push down approvals to provincial level. What happens then? Provinces get together with the state-owned enterprises. They start building huge numbers of coal-fired power plants. Because they want the business, etc., though nobody seems to have spotted the demand flattening. But anyway, so suddenly Xi Jinping has to say, no, this isn't good enough, I'm taking the power back again. So again, the energy sector is always the one which is very difficult to delegate, because if you do, stuff happens that you don't want to happen. So he had to take that power back. And then other people have argued that, all these new coal-fired power plants, they're the best in the world. That's great. But they're all new. How long does a coal-fired power plant last? 40 years? Could be 50. So in fact, China has locked itself in to a coal-fired power sector for the next half a century. So there's a but there. Also, coal, because it's cheap in China and plentiful, is what I call the swing fuel in China's energy sector. So whenever the economy picks up, it's coal that is the first source of energy to be used more. And that's precisely what happened in 2017, when the economy was growing a little faster than usual, heavy industry growing a little faster, more construction, etc. Coal use goes up for the first time in 3 years, and carbon emissions go up. So that's the problem. So he has to have enough economic growth to keep everybody happy and employed, but not too much to push emissions, coal use, and air pollution up. Natural gas should be substituting coal. Yeah. I mean, that's been the strategy for the last 15 years. But the trouble is, in China, there is no cheap natural gas. It's either a long way away in the far northwest of the country, or the geology is difficult. I used to be a geologist in China, so I know. Or it's imported, in which case it's coming from Turkmenistan, which is a long way away, imported liquefied natural gas, which today is cheap, but this price goes up and down by a factor of 100%. So it's sometimes cheap, it's sometimes not cheap. They've got shale gas potential, but the rocks are much more difficult than the US, and so this is proving much more difficult. So the gas is creeping upwards slowly, but it's mainly used in industry and in households for district heating. It hasn't really got into the power sector yet. So coal remains at the core of the power sector, together with hydro, nuclear, wind, solar. So fossil fuels are difficult, mainly because coal is the cheapest, and they just built a whole raft of new coal-fired thermal plants. Energy efficiency. Over the last 40 years, energy intensity, which is the measure of energy use per GDP, has just been going down amazingly, and particularly since 2004, when literally the lights were going out across China because economic growth was 15%. The government has put in a huge effort to close down inefficient plants, bring in new appliances, etc. And it's, again, administrative means. But, they've plucked the low-hanging fruit. The steel industries are sort of sorted. The problem now, and the big industries are sorted, is the small and medium-sized enterprises, the households, families who like lots of air conditioning or heating. So I think it's going to be a real struggle to take the big achievements of the last 10 or 15 years down across the country, because again, prices are often controlled by governments, particularly for households. And although they've started having ESCOs, which are energy service companies that will advise small and medium-sized enterprises how to become more efficient, this isn't working very well yet. Okay, so I think the energy efficiency story, successful so far. Let's see how it goes. I'm now going to slightly digress to a blind spot, the water, energy, food nexus. Do you ever talk about this in your course? Right. Oh, well, I'll give you the 3-hour lecture then. No. Let's keep it simple. Water, energy. Okay? To make energy, you need a lot of water, whether it be coal mines for washing, power stations, oil fields, refineries, nuclear power stations, coal-fired power stations. Use a lot of water. Okay? Some of that water is just can be recycled, other is actually used. And one of China's problems is a lot of its oil fields, coal-fired power stations are in the north of the country. What do we know about the north of China? There ain't any water. Okay, so you've got a real tension there. There's a water problem anyway in China, and the energy sector just makes it worse. Energy for water. A lot of the water there is a long way from where it's needed, so you need to pump the water, you need to clean the water, process the water before and after use. So there's a whole issue of energy use for the water supply. Okay. So these two things are aspects which China is working on, but it's got a long way to go. Water, energy, food, the angle that I've looked at is a bit odd, but it's quite interesting. But that's what academics do, isn't it? They pick odd things. Fertilizer. You say fertilizer, what? Chemical nitrogen fertilizer. Mao created a whole industry based on an extremely inefficient technology. Instead of making the nitrogen fertilizer, the ammonia that goes into nitrogen fertilizer, instead of making the ammonia from natural gas, he made it from coal. Okay, because they had a lot of coal, and you could have very small plants in every county, every locality. But this is extremely energy inefficient, extremely water inefficient, and it makes extremely inefficient fertilizer. Okay, and the move away from that has been very slow. And then the other problem is the farmers use the fertilizer very inefficiently. Okay, so they spread huge amounts on, not at the right time. The more you put on, the more water you use, so you're wasting water, you're wasting the fertilizer, which then means you're wasting coal and pushing emissions up. It also poisons the soil, it poisons the water, and it damages the ozone layer, the nitrous oxide that comes out of these fertilizers on the field. So the nitrous, if you want an obscure thesis topic, look at nitrogenous chemical fertilizers. It's really horrible stuff, and China is the world capital of horrible behavior. Okay, so obscure one there. It's real struggle to deal with, not least because you've got a few tens of millions of farmers. So how do we solve it? We bring in carbon pricing, surely. Yeah. And those of you who read the newspapers will have seen that China is launching a national carbon emissions trading market in 2018. Will this solve everything, or will it solve nothing? Well, they've been carrying out pilot projects of carbon emissions trading in certain provinces, and they've sort of gone all right. There's been trading, but very low liquidity, over allocation of permits, which happened in Europe too, free allocation of permits, but very little trading actually, though there's some news that, in these areas you saw more low-carbon businesses starting. So sort of mixed results of the pilot. Now, with the national scheme, they're just going to limit it to the power sector. Okay, all those coal-fired power plants and gas power plants, etc., etc. We don't know what the rules will be, but it'll probably be free allocation and grandfathering, which means you look at your past to predict your future, and then you allocate on that basis, and what they call the benchmarking method, so different technologies will get different treatment. But at the same time, they're also starting to marketize the power sector. So they got two experiments going on at the same time. And so you've got two unknowns. They're trying to liberalize the power sector gently. I won't go into the details. They're trying to create carbon trading. So I think these first years will be full of uncertainty. But if I step back and throw my brick into the pool, I say to myself, not being a specialist in carbon trading, most of the big emitters of carbon are state-owned enterprises at central or local level with soft budgetary constraints and political backing. So to me, being very simplistic, carbon trading just becomes another game to play. That you can make a bit of money or appear to be doing good things, but does it actually push the pressure on the companies to reduce their emissions? I don't know. I'm a skeptic, but I'm not the only skeptic. But anyway, watch this space for the carbon emissions trading program to be launched in 2018. So, conclusions. China is a global clean energy champion. Yeah, in many respects. It's big, it's done a lot of stuff, it's put a lot of resources in that we are benefiting from because the windmills are cheaper, the solar panels are cheaper, even nuclear power may be cheaper if they come to Britain. But at huge financial cost to the country, to the society, with many flaws and distortions that we talked about, and a few blind spots. And these have been achieved by administrative measures, i.e. the government has basically said, going back to Williamson's diagram, the institutional environment hasn't really changed very much, particularly in the energy sector. We stick to what we know, we use administrative measures, command and control, and throw money at the problem. We can solve it, maybe, except huge country, authoritarian but fragmented, lots of interests. But an impressive display of adaptation. It has, I've been working in or on China since 1990, amazing adaptability to the environmental challenge of clean air and low carbon. So how has this been achieved? In a limited access social order, in a society which the institutionalists say should not be adaptable. It's achieved by doing it the way they've always done it, but, and this is the but that I think challenges the institutional theory, with a huge level of capital, political capital, financial capital, and social capital, or human capital, meaning they've got lots of people with technical training, and you've got a very energetic and entrepreneurial workforce and managers eager to get stuff done. Okay, anybody who's been to China knows there's lots of energetic people out there that get stuff done. So I think the exception, China is, as it were, the exception to the adaptive capacity rule because it's got all this capital. I mean, we know this in life. Someone who isn't very competent, no, I'm not thinking about Trump, am I? Can throw money at a problem and get success. Okay, and so to me, capital, human capital, political capital, right from the top, human capital has solved that problem, and thus it is, as it were, an exception to the institutional interpretation. But there's a real question that I have: how long can this model be sustained? How long can they just keep on throwing capital at this transition problem to keep going? And the problem is that the government is a sort of schizophrenic. On the one hand, it wants market forces to work in energy, but on the other hand, it wants state control. And so that's why there's always sort of 2 steps forward, 1 step back when it comes to market forces, and I haven't really had time to go into that. So finally then, to what extent can other countries emulate China? Okay, there are a lot of other limited access social orders around, immature democracies, or even Japan and Korea, where you've got a strong elite governing the country. Yes, but you need this huge amount of capital. Yeah, you can't just do it if you're poor, either in political capital, human capital, or financial capital. So where do I look for parallels? Gulf countries, maybe, Saudi, Emirates, Kuwait, those sorts of places. They have the political capital, they have the financial capital, and they can import the human capital. Yeah, look at the Emirates with their nuclear power program, they just imported everybody. Okay. But I find it quite difficult to, for discussion, to locate another country that could do what China did to such a degree. But even what China has achieved, as I said, by lifting the veil, has a lot of flaws in it with the inefficient use of resources, and I think more challenges to come to keep itself on this trajectory. So I will stop now and thank you for your attention.